I came to the bank to close my account, but the banker went pale and said, have you seen the balance on your account? There was $39 million. I had never seen that kind of money in my life. My name is Melanie, 34 years old, and my family threw me out like garbage because my husband got my younger sister pregnant. They thought I was walking away with nothing but a cardboard box. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The cardboard box in my hands felt incredibly heavy, even though it only contained a few framed photos, a favorite coffee mug, and my laptop. I stood in the center of the living room, the space I had meticulously decorated over the past 6 years of my marriage. I remembered picking out the gray sectional sofa, painting the accent wall, and building a life I thought was secure. Across from me stood my husband, Brandon. His arm was wrapped tightly around the waist of another woman. That woman was Courtney, my younger sister. I stared at his hand resting on her hip, my brain refusing to process the visual information. This was the man who had promised to love me forever. This was the sister I had shared childhood secrets with. Now they stood united against me, wearing matching expressions of smug satisfaction. The air in the room was suffocating. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the open concept kitchen, a mundane sound that mocked the absolute destruction of my reality. My mother Beverly stood behind the marble kitchen island. She did not look at me with sympathy or regret. She looked at me with the same cold, calculating disappointment she had directed my way since I was a teenager. She picked up a thick manila folder and slid it across the smooth marble surface. The heavy thud of the paper echoed in the quiet room. "Sign them, Melanie," my mother commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the divorce papers. "We are doing this quickly and quietly. Courtney is pregnant. Brandon needs a real wife who can give him a family, not a college dropout who plays with computer codes in the basement all day." The words hit me like physical blows. Courtney is pregnant. My sister was carrying my husband's child. I looked at Courtney, the undeniable golden child of our family. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood, Courtney was the cheerleader, the prom queen, the one who did everything right, according to my mother's strict standards. She was the one who got the lavish birthday parties and the expensive clothes. I was the quiet one, the girl who preferred taking apart computers and teaching myself programming languages. When I dropped out of college to pursue UX and UI development full-time, my mother had declared me a lost cause. She had never forgiven me for choosing a non-traditional path. Now she was literally replacing me with the daughter she always preferred. Courtney had always taken what was mine. In high school, it was my friends. In college, it was the attention of our parents. And now in adulthood, it was my husband. Beverly had always enabled this behavior, telling me I needed to share, that I needed to be the bigger person, because Courtney was younger and more sensitive. The reality was that Courtney was a manipulative opportunist, and my mother was her biggest enabler. Seeing them standing in my kitchen, effectively stealing my life, felt like the tragic but inevitable culmination of 34 years of toxic family dynamics. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling, "how can you stand there and support this? She is my sister. He is my husband." Beverly crossed her arms, her posture rigid and unforgiving. "Oh, please grow up, Melanie. Brandon deserves a woman who is actually present in a marriage. You have spent the last 3 years locked in that dark basement, staring at a screen, working on some ridiculous project that went absolutely nowhere. Courtney is offering him a real future. You should be apologizing to him for wasting 6 years of his life." Brandon finally spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. "Listen to your mother, Mel. It is over. You need to leave. Today. This house is in my name anyway. You know that." He stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Hand over the keys to the Audi. I paid the down payment, and I am not letting you drive off in my investment. I need it for Courtney and the baby. They need a safe, reliable vehicle." I stared at the man I had shared a bed with, cooked meals for, and loved with all my heart. He was looking at me like I was a stranger who had overstayed my welcome. My hands shook as I reached into my pocket, pulled out the car keys, and dropped them onto the kitchen island. They hit the marble with a sharp clatter. How am I supposed to get anywhere? I asked, fighting back tears. Where am I supposed to go? Brandon scoffed, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. That is not my problem. You have your own bank account. There is exactly $500 in there. I checked this morning before I transferred the rest of our joint funds to my personal account. $500 is more than enough for a motel and a bus ticket. You can figure the rest out yourself. You are supposed to be the smart one, right? You really thought you were going to be the next big tech genius, did not you? Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that cut straight through my chest. 3 years. You spent 3 entire years ignoring me, ignoring this marriage building, that stupid accessibility software plugin. You swore it was going to change the world. You swore it was going to make millions. And what happened? Nothing. It was a complete commercial failure. Nobody wanted your little code, Melanie. You are a failure as a developer and a failure as a wife. The mention of my software plugin felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I had poured my soul into that code. It was designed to help visually impaired users navigate complex digital interfaces effortlessly. I had worked through weekends, skipped holidays, and drained my energy trying to perfect every single line of code. When I finally launched it, the market response had been abysmal. Brandon had never let me forget that failure, using it as constant proof that I should have listened to my mother and gotten a normal corporate job. He used my passion as a weapon to make me feel small and dependent on him. Courtney leaned her head against Brandon's shoulder and let out a soft theatrical sigh, rubbing her completely flat stomach. Just sign the papers, Mel. Stop making this so difficult for everyone. We want to start decorating the nursery, and your negative energy is really bad for the baby. Mom says stress is terrible for the first trimester, and you are just dragging this out because you cannot accept that Brandon chose me. I looked at the 3 of them, my mother, my sister, my husband. They had formed a united front of betrayal, a perfect triangle of cruelty designed to break me completely. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of them so they could justify their horrific actions. They wanted to cast me as the crazy, unstable ex-wife so they could play the happy new family without an ounce of guilt. I realized in that exact moment that I had spent my entire life trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of loving anyone but themselves. I set my cardboard box down on the floor. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the pen lying next to the divorce papers, and flipped to the last page. I did not read the terms. I did not care about the division of assets or the legal jargon they had undoubtedly skewed in his favor. I just wanted to sever myself from these monsters as quickly as possible. I signed my name with a steady hand, pressing the pen down so hard it nearly tore through the paper. I pushed the documents back toward my mother, maintaining eye contact. Keep the house. I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of the emotion they so desperately wanted to see. Keep the car. Keep him. You all deserve exactly what you get. I picked up my box, turned my back on the people who had destroyed my life, and walked out the front door. The afternoon sun was blinding as I stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was quiet, completely oblivious to the domestic nightmare that had just unfolded inside the manicured walls of my former home. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare with the very last of my battery. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching my meager belongings, waiting for a stranger to drive me away from the only life I had known for 6 years. When the car pulled up, I climbed into the back seat. The driver asked me how my day was going in a cheerful tone. I just stared out the window, completely numb, stripped of my dignity, my marriage, and my family in a single afternoon. The vinyl seat of the rideshare felt cold against my legs. I watched the familiar suburban streets roll by, the perfectly trimmed hedges and luxury SUVs, sitting in driveways, feeling like an alien expelled from a planet I had tried so hard to inhabit. For 6 years, I had played the role of the supportive wife, cooking dinners, managing the household, and trying to be the partner Brandon claimed he wanted. I had tolerated his passive-aggressive comments about my income and ignored the late nights he claimed to be working at the office. I had been so blindly focused on making my marriage succeed and proving my mother wrong that I completely missed the affair happening right under my nose. The betrayal was an absolute physical weight on my chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I checked my bank app on my phone one last time to confirm the devastating reality. $500. That was the sum total of my worth after a lifetime of trying to do the right thing. My heart pounded heavily in my chest as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the wreckage of my existence. I needed to cut every single tie to Brandon to erase my name from his life completely. I instructed the driver to change the destination. I was not going to a motel just yet. I was going to the bank. My only thought was to head straight downtown and close the dormant business bank account I had opened years ago when I first started coding. It was the only financial thread left, and I wanted it gone. The rideshare pulled up to the curb outside the First National Bank branch in downtown Seattle. I thanked the driver mechanically and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, holding my cardboard box tightly against my chest. The glass doors of the bank slid open with a soft mechanical hum, welcoming me into a sterile environment of polished marble and hushed conversations. The contrast between my shattered personal life and this calm professional space was incredibly jarring. I walked over to the reception desk, my sneakers squeaking slightly on the pristine floor. A young woman in a tailored suit looked up with a polite corporate smile, asking how she could assist me today. I told her I needed to close a business account. It was a simple request, but the words tasted heavy and bitter on my tongue. She asked me to take a seat in the waiting area, pointing toward a row of leather chairs. I sat down, placing my box on the empty seat next to me. I stared at the geometric patterns on the carpet, trying to keep my mind completely blank and free from the searing pain of betrayal. If I allowed myself to think about Brandon and Courtney in my house, decorating a nursery while I sat here with $500 to my name, I knew I would completely fall apart. I needed to focus entirely on logistics. Closing this account was a logistical necessity. It was an old dormant account I had opened 5 years ago when I first started taking freelance coding projects. Brandon had insisted we open it to keep my hobby money separate from our real finances. The account had not seen a single deposit or withdrawal in over 3 years. I just needed to drain whatever pennies were left in it, sign the closure forms, and officially erase Brandon from my financial existence. Sitting in the quiet lobby, I remembered the exact day we opened that account. Brandon had worn his favorite navy suit, treating the whole endeavor like a cute little project I was playing at. He had told the bank teller that his wife wanted to feel like a real businesswoman. I remembered the heat rising in my cheeks, the intense embarrassment of being belittled in public by the man who was supposed to support me. But I had swallowed my pride, forced a smile, and signed the paperwork. For years, that account sat there, collecting dust after my accessibility software plugin failed to launch properly. Brandon had made sure to remind me of that failure, constantly using the empty account as concrete proof that I was meant to stay in the background and serve him. Now I was about to close that dark chapter forever. A thick wooden door opened down the hall, and a tall man with thinning gray hair stepped out into the lobby. He wore a gold name tag that identified him as Mr. Harrison, the branch manager. He called my name, and I stood up, grabbing my box with sweaty palms. He gestured toward his glass-walled office, offering a warm smile that felt entirely out of place in my current horrific reality. I followed him inside and sat in the plush guest chair, setting my belongings carefully on the floor by my feet. Mr. Harrison sat behind his large oak desk, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, before asking how he could help me today. I stated my purpose clearly, keeping my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I told him I needed to completely close my business checking account today and withdraw any remaining funds so I could be on my way. Mr. Harrison nodded professionally, reaching for his computer keyboard. He told me that would be no problem at all and asked for my identification. I dug into my coat pocket, pulled out my identification card, and slid it across the smooth surface of his desk. He took it, verified my face against the photo, and began typing my information into his secure system. The rapid clicking of his keyboard filled the small office. I watched his fingers move, feeling a strange sense of profound finality. Once this administrative task was done, I would truly have nothing left tying me to my past. Mr. Harrison made polite small talk while he waited for the banking system to load. He mentioned the unseasonably warm weather we were having and asked if I had any exciting plans for the upcoming weekend. I gave a non-committal response, staring blankly at the beige wall behind his head. I did not want to tell this kind stranger that my weekend plans consisted of finding a cheap motel room and figuring out how to rebuild a human life from absolute zero. I just wanted him to hand me a cashier check for whatever pocket change was left in the account, so I could leave and find a quiet place to cry in absolute peace away from the judging eyes of the world. The computer screen reflected brightly in his glasses, casting a faint blue glow across his eyes. I expected him to print out a piece of paper, hand me a cheap plastic pen, and send me out the heavy glass door. Instead, the rapid clicking of his keyboard suddenly stopped. The silence in the office stretched out, becoming thick and incredibly uncomfortable. I watched as Mr. Harrison leaned much closer to his monitor, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He took off his glasses, wiped them quickly with a microfiber cloth from his top desk drawer, and put them back on his face. He peered at the screen again, his posture completely changing. The relaxed, casual demeanor of a local branch manager vanished in an instant. He sat up rigid, his shoulders visibly tense under his suit jacket. I saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. The healthy color began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly white. A bead of nervous sweat formed at his temple. He began clicking his mouse frantically, opening new windows on his screen, checking and rechecking whatever impossible information had just popped up. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, feeling a sudden spike of raw anxiety. My mind raced through the absolute worst possible scenarios. Had Brandon somehow overdrawn the account and left me with a massive, insurmountable debt? Had my mother filed some sort of malicious legal injunction to freeze my assets just to punish me further? Had Courtney stolen my identity to open new credit lines? I leaned forward, gripping the leather armrests of my chair, and asked if there was a problem with the account. Mr. Harrison did not answer right away. He just kept staring at the glowing monitor, his mouth slightly open as if he had completely forgotten how to speak the English language. Finally, Mr. Harrison looked away from the screen and met my eyes. He looked absolutely terrified. His hands were shaking visibly as they hovered awkwardly over his keyboard. "Miss Melanie," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, sounding incredibly nervous and out of breath. "I need to ask you a very important question. Are you currently expecting any exceedingly large deposits to be made into this business account today?" I frowned, completely bewildered by the absurd question. I told him no. I explained clearly that the account had been inactive for over 3 years and that I just wanted to close it out and take my few dollars. Mr. Harrison wiped his damp forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost standing right behind me. He took a deep, shaky breath and asked if I was aware of the pending wire transfer that had cleared the international banking holding period that exact morning. My confusion rapidly deepened into genuine frustration. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I repeated that my husband had just thrown me out of my home, that I only had $500 to my name in my personal account, and that there must be some kind of massive administrative error in his banking system. Mr. Harrison shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a profound mixture of shock and sheer awe. He did not say another word. Instead, he reached his shaking hands out, grabbed the edge of his large computer monitor, and slowly turned the screen around to face me. He pointed a trembling finger at the bold green numbers displayed prominently at the top of the secure banking portal. I blinked, trying to make sense of the digital display in front of my face. I fully expected to see a negative balance or a bright red fraud alert warning me of overdraft fees. But that is not what was glowing on the screen. The balance on the screen was not zero, it was not negative. I read the numbers once and then I read them again, my brain refusing to process the math. The balance was $39,450,000 and 0 cents. I sat completely frozen in the chair. my heart pounding violently against my ribs as I stared at a staggering number that defied all logic and reality. I stared at the screen, my mind completely rejecting the information presented in front of me. The bright green numbers felt like a cruel prank, a systemic glitch that was going to evaporate the second I blinked. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of Mr. Harrison's desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. I demanded an immediate explanation. I told him there was absolutely no way that money belonged to me and that somebody had made a catastrophic error. I demanded he refresh the page, call his superiors, and fix whatever routing mistake had dumped the gross domestic product of a small island nation into my dormant business checking account. Mr. Harrison did not argue. He nodded, his face still pale, and immediately picked up his heavy desk phone. He pressed a sequence of buttons and put the call on speakerphone. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered, identifying himself as David from the Central Fraud and Corporate Transition Department. Mr. Harrison provided his branch identification number and employee authorization code. He explained that he had a client sitting in his office who had just received an unexpected wire transfer of nearly $40 million, and that we needed immediate origin verification and security clearance to ensure the funds were not part of a larger banking error. David asked for my full legal name, my social security number, and the exact date I opened the account. I rattled off the information, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. I listened to the rapid clicking of another keyboard on the other end of the line. The silence stretched out agonizingly long. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling above us. Finally, David returned to the line. He confirmed that my identity matched the sole proprietor listed on the receiving account. He then stated that the wire transfer was not an error. It was a fully cleared, authorized corporate disbursement from Apex Global. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Apex Global was one of the largest tech conglomerates in Silicon Valley. They were the undisputed titans of the industry, acquiring smaller companies and absorbing innovative technologies to build their massive empire. I told David I had no business relationship with Apex Global. I told him I was a freelance developer who had spent the last 3 years working in a damp basement, creating a simple accessibility plugin that had completely failed to launch in the commercial market. I insisted they had the wrong person, and that keeping this money could send me to federal prison. David paused. I could hear the rustle of digital files being accessed through his secure terminal. He asked me to verify the name of my software plugin. I told him the name. It was a unique identifier I had coded from scratch to help visually impaired users interact with dynamic web elements seamlessly. David confirmed the name, matching it to his records. He then asked if I was aware of a holding company registered in the state of Delaware under the name Horizon Tech Solutions. I frowned, my confusion deepening into a dense fog. I told him I had never heard of Horizon Tech Solutions in my entire life. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, crossing his arms. David's tone became incredibly serious and measured, as if he were delivering a terminal diagnosis. He informed me that Horizon Tech Solutions had been licensing my exact accessibility plugin to Apex Global for the past 4 years. According to the corporate ledgers, Apex Global had integrated my core code into their primary operating systems, rolling it out to millions of devices worldwide. The holding company Horizon Tech Solutions had been receiving massive, lucrative quarterly royalty payments for the licensed use of that intellectual property. My breath caught in my throat. I asked David who owned Horizon Tech Solutions. I asked him who was listed as the managing director of the holding company that had been illegally leasing my proprietary code. The answer shattered my entire reality into a million jagged pieces. David read the name clearly over the speakerphone, articulating every syllable. The managing director and sole signatory on the Delaware holding company was my husband, Brandon. The room started to spin violently. I closed my eyes as a wave of intense physical nausea washed over me. Brandon had taken my code, The code I had spent countless sleepless nights writing, the code I had poured my heart and soul into. He had taken it behind my back and licensed it to one of the biggest tech giants in the world. He had forged my signature to transfer the licensing rights to a secret shell company he controlled entirely. And he had been collecting quiet, lucrative royalties for 4 years while watching me suffer. Memories flooded my mind, cascading like a violent waterfall of deception. I remembered every single time Brandon had come down to the basement to watch me work. He would stand over my shoulder, feigning supportive interest, asking me detailed questions about how the back-end integration worked. He would offer to help me with the complicated legal paperwork and the initial patent filing, claiming he wanted to handle the boring business side so I could focus entirely on the creative coding process. I had trusted him implicitly. I had handed him the very documents he needed to steal my life work. But the theft of the code was not the worst part. The absolute worst part was the psychological warfare he had waged against me for years. I remembered the nights I sat crying on the cold bathroom floor, feeling like an absolute failure because my plugin had supposedly garnered zero market interest. Brandon would sit beside me, rubbing my back, putting on a masterclass performance of the loving, supportive husband. He would tell me that the tech market was just too competitive, that my ideas were just a little too niche, and that I should not feel bad about failing. He would use my devastation to convince me that I needed to rely entirely on him for survival. He had deliberately weaponized my perceived failure to control every aspect of my existence. He had used it to justify his condescending remarks, his financial abuse, and his constant demands that I play the role of the subservient, grateful wife. My mother had eagerly joined in echoing his sentiments, mocking my ambition, and telling everyone in our social circle that I was a lost cause. They had formed a unified front of gaslighting, making me believe I was inherently worthless, while Brandon was literally cashing massive checks generated by my own brilliance. He had watched me eat cheap ramen noodles and stress over basic grocery bills while he sat on a secret fortune built entirely on my intellectual property. The sheer scale of the sociopathic manipulation was difficult to process. I sat in the bank manager's office, my hands gripping the armrests, trying to breathe through the overwhelming panic attack threatening to consume my lungs. I asked David to clarify the current situation. I asked him why Brandon had been receiving royalties for years, but suddenly a $39 million wire transfer was routed directly to my old dormant checking account instead of his secret holding company. David explained the timeline with forensic precision. He told me that for the first 3 years, Apex Global had simply paid standard licensing fees to Horizon Tech Solutions. However, 2 months ago, the executive board at Apex Global decided they no longer wanted to pay ongoing royalties. They wanted to own the foundational code outright, so they could permanently integrate it into a new line of proprietary hardware without any external dependencies or future costs. They initiated a massive corporate buyout to fully acquire the intellectual property from the holding company. The buyout offer was astronomical. The tech giant had valued the core accessibility framework at nearly $40 million due to its flawless integration capabilities and the massive global user base it supported. Brandon had been sitting on the verge of the ultimate payday. He was about to receive a life-changing sum of money that would secure his wealth forever. He had undoubtedly planned to finalize the divorce, throw me out with nothing, and step into his new life with my sister as a multimillionaire. It was the perfect crime. He would get the money, the new wife, the golden child sister, and I would be left completely destitute, believing I was nothing more than a pathetic failed developer. But his perfect crime had encountered a fatal flaw. David continued explaining the corporate mechanics of the buyout process. When a company like Apex Global executes a multi-million-dollar acquisition, they do not simply hand over a check blindly. They employ armies of ruthless corporate lawyers and forensic accountants to conduct rigorous due diligence. They comb through every single page of documentation to ensure the intellectual property is completely unencumbered and legally sound. They have to protect their massive investment from any future litigation or ownership disputes. During this intense due diligence phase, the tech giant aggressive legal team began auditing the original transfer of ownership documents between me, the original creator, and Horizon Tech Solutions, Brandon's shell company. They flagged massive, glaring inconsistencies. They scrutinized the signatures, the dates, and the notary stamps. They utilized advanced forensic verification software and quickly realized that the original transfer documents were entirely fraudulent. Brandon had clumsily forged my signature. He had completely fabricated the transfer of rights. Legally, Horizon Tech Solutions did not own the software. They never had. David's voice remained perfectly steady as he delivered the final piece of information. He told me that when the corporate lawyers discovered the forgery, they immediately halted all communication with Brandon Holding Company. They knew that if they paid Brandon for stolen intellectual property, they would be opening themselves up to a catastrophic multi-million-dollar lawsuit from the actual creator. They needed to secure the rights legally, and they needed to do it quietly to avoid any negative press or delays in their highly anticipated hardware rollout. So they bypassed Brandon entirely. They utilized their extensive corporate resources to track down the original patent holder. They verified my identity and located the original business account tied to my initial patent filing, the very account I was currently sitting in a bank trying to close. To secure the rights legally and completely, bypass the fraudulent holding company. The tech giant wired the $39 million buyout directly to me. I sat in the chair, the jagged pieces of the puzzle finally locking into perfect place. The cruelty of my morning suddenly made crystal clear sense. Brandon's sudden demand for a divorce, the rushed paperwork, my mother vicious insults, Courtney's smug satisfaction. They all thought the buyout was happening today. They thought the money was hitting Brandon's secret account right now. They were tossing me out like garbage because they believed they had finally won. They believed they had successfully stolen my life work and were about to become incredibly wealthy at my expense. They had absolutely no idea that Brandon's greed and arrogance had caused his entire plan to collapse at the finish line. They had no idea that the corporate lawyers had caught his forgery. And most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that the massive fortune they were currently celebrating had just landed securely in my personal bank account. The silence in the bank manager office was absolute. I sat staring at the speakerphone trying to absorb the magnitude of what David from Apex Global had just revealed. The tech giant aggressive legal team had not just found a minor clerical error, they had uncovered a deliberate, calculated felony. David explained that during their rigorous due diligence phase, their forensic accountants tore through every single document tied to Horizon Tech Solutions. They were preparing to transfer nearly $40 million, and companies of that massive size do not take blind risks. When they scrutinized the original transfer of ownership, they immediately flagged the signature. Brandon had been incredibly sloppy. He had traced my signature from our old mortgage documents, but he failed to replicate the natural pressure and flow of my handwriting. The corporate lawyers at Apex Global recognized the forgery instantly using their advanced verification software. David's voice remained completely clinical as he described how they froze Brandon out of the entire transaction. They realized that Horizon Tech Solutions did not legally own the patent for my accessibility plugin. If Apex Global proceeded with the buyout and paid Brandon's shell company, they would be acquiring stolen intellectual property. That would open them up to a massive, devastating lawsuit from the actual creator the moment the product launched globally. They could not afford that kind of legal exposure or public relations nightmare. To secure the rights legally and quietly, they executed an immediate contingency plan. They bypassed Brandon and his fraudulent LLC entirely. They traced the original patent registration back to me, verified my identity, and routed the $39 million buyout directly to the sole legitimate patent holder. I looked at Mr. Harrison, who was wiping his forehead with a cotton handkerchief. I asked David what Brandon knew about this sudden change in the financial routing. David replied that their legal department had issued a standard delay notice to Horizon Tech Solutions, citing routine compliance checks. They had completely frozen him out of the communication loop while they secured the asset directly from me to prevent any interference. Brandon was sitting at home right now, believing his payday was just delayed by a few administrative days. He had absolutely no idea the tech giant had discovered his crime and wired the funds to his discarded wife. The phone call ended, leaving a heavy charged silence in the small office. I looked back at the computer monitor. The $39 million sat there in bright green numbers. It was real, and it was legally mine. But the initial shock was rapidly giving way to a new kind of terror. I was sitting in a standard commercial bank branch with a fortune sitting in a vulnerable, dormant checking account. I was legally married to a man who had just handed me divorce papers and thrown me out of my home to be with my pregnant sister. If Brandon found out this money existed, he would use every dirty legal trick in the book to claim half of it as a marital asset. He would drag me through years of grueling litigation to drain my resources and force a settlement. Mr. Harrison seemed to read my mind perfectly. He leaned forward, folding his hands on his polished oak desk. He told me that keeping this amount of capital in a standard business checking account was incredibly dangerous, especially given my current domestic situation. He explained that my husband could easily attempt to freeze my assets the moment he realized the money had bypassed his shell company. I needed specialized protection immediately. Mr. Harrison picked up his phone again. He told me he knew exactly who I needed to call to fix this. He dialed a private number and spoke in low, urgent tones, requesting immediate assistance for a high-net-worth client facing a domestic crisis. Within 20 minutes, a woman walked into the bank branch. She bypassed the waiting area entirely and strode directly into Mr. Harrison's office. This was Diana. She wore an immaculate charcoal-tailored suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. Diana was a high-end wealth management attorney who specialized in protecting the assets of ultra-high net worth individuals from hostile litigation. Mr. Harrison introduced us quickly, stepping back to let her take complete control of the room. Diana did not offer empty sympathy or useless platitudes about my broken marriage. She sat down across from me, opened her briefcase, and looked at me with piercing dark eyes. She told me we had a very narrow window of time to secure my future before my husband realized his fraudulent empire had collapsed. She asked me a series of rapid-fire questions about my marriage, the divorce papers I had just signed, and the exact timeline of Brandon's actions today. I answered her with complete transparency, laying out every detail of his betrayal, my sister pregnancy, and the horrific scene I had just escaped in my living room. Diana listened without interrupting her expression, hardening into a look of predatory focus. When I finished, she leaned back and delivered her brilliant assessment. She told me that Brandon had severely miscalculated his position. By forcing me to sign the divorce papers under duress today and demanding I leave the property, he had initiated the separation of our lives before the buyout funds were officially discovered or processed into his account. However, we needed to ensure this money was completely shielded from any future marital asset claims he might attempt to file. She explained that if the money stayed in a domestic account tied to my name, Brandon lawyers could petition a local judge to freeze it during the divorce discovery phase. We could not let that happen under any circumstances. Diana outlined a ruthless, highly effective legal strategy to protect me. She told me she was going to establish a secure, heavily protected offshore trust immediately. This trust would be registered in a jurisdiction with ironclad asset protection laws, specifically designed to shield capital from hostile domestic litigation. The trust would be established solely in my name as the primary beneficiary, but structured in a way that made the assets legally untouchable by any impending divorce proceedings or fraudulent claims from my soon-to-be ex-husband. She pulled a stack of dense legal documents from her briefcase. She had clearly anticipated this exact scenario when Mr. Harrison called her. She walked me through every single page, explaining the complex mechanics of the offshore entity. She detailed how the funds would be routed through a series of secure institutional accounts, completely masking the money trail from anyone trying to perform a basic domestic asset search. She assured me that this was entirely legal and standard practice for individuals experiencing sudden, massive liquidity events under hostile personal circumstances. I picked up the heavy silver pen she offered me. My hand was no longer shaking with fear or sadness. The crushing weight of the morning betrayal was being rapidly replaced by a cold, calculated determination to survive. I signed the documents authorizing Diana to establish the trust and execute the immediate transfer of the $39 million. Mr. Harrison processed the paperwork without hesitation, utilizing his top-level managerial clearance to expedite the massive international wire transfer. I watched the computer monitor as the bright green numbers disappeared from my dormant business account. The balance returned to exactly zero. The money was gone, securely routed into an impenetrable financial fortress that Brandon could never touch. Diana packed her documents back into her briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a satisfying, confident click. She told me the trust was now active and the funds were fully protected from any domestic interference. She handed me a sleek, black encrypted debit card tied to a secure domestic allowance account, ensuring I had immediate access to whatever funds I needed to live comfortably without exposing the primary trust. Diana gave me strict, unwavering instructions for the coming weeks. I was to maintain absolute silence about the money. I was not to confront Brandon about the forgery under any circumstances. I was not to warn my family about their impending doom. I was to let them proceed with their arrogant, false narrative. She told me to let Brandon file the divorce papers he had forced me to sign. We would let him believe he was casting me aside with absolutely nothing to my name. She smiled a sharp, dangerous smile that made me glad she was on my side. She told me that in high-stakes litigation the most powerful weapon is always the information the enemy does not know you have. We were going to let Brandon dig his own grave while he thought he was burying me. I walked out of the bank with Diana business card safely tucked in my pocket and the encrypted debit card hidden in my wallet. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, beautiful golden shadows across the bustling Seattle skyline. I stood on the busy sidewalk, watching the city move around me with a newfound sense of clarity. A few short hours ago, I had been a discarded, broken wife, clutching a cardboard box, believing my life was entirely over. Now I was a multimillionaire, backed by a ruthless legal team, holding the ultimate power to completely destroy the people who had tried to break me. I thought about Brandon. I pictured him sitting in the living room I had decorated, rubbing Courtney's pregnant belly, and eagerly checking his secret Horizon Tech Solutions account on his phone. He was waiting for the $39 million to drop. He was probably already planning exactly how to spend it. He was likely looking at luxury sports cars, browsing massive real estate listings, and celebrating his perfect, flawless crime. He still thought his massive payday was imminent. He still thought he had outsmarted the corporate lawyers, the international banking system, and his naive, trusting wife. He had absolutely no idea that the money he had stolen my code to get was already sitting safely in my offshore trust. He had no idea that his forgery had been discovered by some of the most aggressive corporate attorneys in Silicon Valley. He had no idea that he had committed federal wire fraud and left a massive digital paper trail leading right back to his shell company. He was currently celebrating a major victory he had not actually won. I thought about my mother, Beverly. I imagined her gloating to her pretentious country club friends about how her golden child Courtney had finally secured a wealthy, successful man. I imagined her sneering at my supposed failure, feeling completely justified in throwing me out onto the street. She believed she had orchestrated the perfect lifestyle upgrade for her favorite daughter. She had traded the broke software developer for the incoming tech multimillionaire. She had no idea she had just tied her favorite daughter to a broke, fraudulent criminal who was about to face absolute financial and legal ruin. A cold, deeply satisfying calm washed over my entire body. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for justice from people incapable of providing it. Justice had already been served to them on a silver platter. I just had to wait patiently for them to realize it. Across town, inside the very house I had painstakingly decorated, Brandon was pacing the hardwood floors. He held his smartphone in a tight grip, his thumb furiously swiping down to refresh his banking application. The screen remained unchanged. The Horizon Tech Solutions account balance sat at a mere few $1,000s. A minor annoyance, he told himself, a simple bureaucratic delay in the grand scheme of his imminent wealth. Apex Global had sent an automated corporate email citing routine compliance checks and a mandatory international holding period for disbursements exceeding $30 million. To a man blinded by his own arrogance, this sounded perfectly standard. Brandon did not possess the technical or legal comprehension to understand that corporate lawyers do not simply delay wire transfers without cause. He firmly believed his fabricated empire was totally secure, and that his massive payout was just stuck in a digital transit queue. But Brandon was an impatient man, and the promise of nearly $40 million burned a hole in his imagination. He could not wait a few administrative days to start living the lifestyle he felt he inherently deserved. He needed immediate liquid capital to fund the lavish reality he had promised his new pregnant bride and his demanding mother-in-law. Brandon picked up his keys and drove his newly claimed Audi to a sleek glass office building in the financial district. He was not visiting a traditional bank. Traditional banks required extensive underwriting and asset verification. Brandon was meeting with a private bridge loan firm, a group of aggressive predatory lenders who specialized in high-risk, high-yield capital advances for corporate acquisitions. He sat across from a sharp-suited loan officer and presented his forged Apex Global term sheet. He projected total confidence, weaving a masterful tale about a delayed corporate buyout and his need for immediate short-term liquidity. The lender examined the Apex Global letterhead. The logo of the tech giant was intoxicating enough to blind even seasoned financiers to potential red flags. They saw the proposed $39 million acquisition, and their eyes lit up with predatory greed. The loan officer agreed to authorize a massive $5 million cash advance. The catch was a staggering double-digit interest rate and a contract that leveraged every single asset Brandon currently owned, including my former house as collateral. Brandon did not even bother to read the fine print. He signed the predatory loan documents with a flourish, entirely convinced he would simply pay off the bridge loan with pocket change the moment his massive wire transfer finally cleared. Brandon returned to the house feeling like an absolute king. He walked through the front door and tossed a heavy leather briefcase onto the kitchen island, right where my divorce papers had sat, just a few days prior. Courtney and Beverly were sitting in the living room flipping through bridal magazines and high-end real estate brochures. Brandon popped the latches on the briefcase, revealing stacks of bundled $100 bills and a certified bank draft. He announced that the first wave of their new fortune had arrived. He told them that the corporate red tape was taking a few extra days, but his brilliant financial maneuvering had secured them millions in walking around money. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Beverly actually squealed, clapping her hands together like a giddy child. Courtney threw her arms around Brandon's neck, kissing him and praising him for being a real provider, a true man who actually knew how to take care of his family. Brandon soaked up their adulation, his ego swelling to massive proportions. He popped a bottle of vintage champagne he had picked up on the way home. As they drank the expensive wine, Brandon looked at my sister and my mother with a smug, satisfied grin. He told them to go out and buy whatever they wanted. He insisted they spare absolutely no expense. He claimed they all deserved a massive reward for putting up with my dead weight for so long, and that it was finally time to show the entire city exactly who the real winners were. Courtney and Beverly did not need to be told twice. The very next morning, they embarked on an exorbitant luxury shopping spree that would have made reality television stars blush. They hired a private town car to drive them to the most exclusive high-end retail district in the city. They walked into designer boutiques, behaving as if they owned the very buildings. Beverly demanded personal shoppers and private viewing rooms, snapping her fingers at sales associates and treating the retail staff with appalling condescension. They bought out entire racks of clothing, sweeping silk dresses, cashmere coats, and tailored suits into their arms without once glancing at a price tag. Courtney focused her attention on luxury accessories. She walked into a prestigious diamond jeweler and sneered at the modest engagement ring Brandon had originally given her. She demanded to see the vault pieces. She spent 2 hours trying on massive flawless diamonds, eventually selecting a breathtaking 6-carat emerald-cut ring surrounded by a halo of brilliant diamonds. She paid for it using the black card Brandon had linked to his new bridge loan account. She slipped the massive stone onto her finger, admiring the way it caught the light, completely oblivious to the fact that the money paying for it was borrowed against a fraudulent corporate claim. Their next stop was the luxury auto mall. Courtney had decided that the Audi Brandon took from me was simply not good enough for a woman of her new, elevated social stature. They walked into a high-end European dealership, demanding immediate service from the general manager. Courtney pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a top-of-the-line, pristine white G-Wagon sitting on the showroom floor. She demanded it be prepped for immediate delivery. Brandon, who had met them at the dealership after a morning of day drinking at an exclusive country club, decided he also needed an upgrade. He selected a custom matte black Porsche 911. They put down massive, non-refundable cash deposits on both vehicles, signing the financing paperwork with absolute arrogant glee. They were spending money with a reckless, chaotic velocity entirely fueled by the delusion of their incoming tech fortune. As the days passed, their spending habits became increasingly unhinged, and their need for public validation grew completely insatiable. Courtney and Beverly could not simply enjoy their new stolen wealth in private. They needed an audience. They needed to rub their perceived victory in the faces of everyone they knew, especially mine. They launched a relentless, aggressive social media assault designed to flaunt their new lifestyle and publicly humiliate me in the process. Courtney's Instagram feed transformed overnight from mundane suburban updates to a curated gallery of extreme wealth. She posted perfectly staged photos of her designer shopping bags stacked high in the back of her new luxury SUV. She posted close-up videos of her massive diamond ring sparkling in the sunlight with the caption mentioning how a real man knows how to treat his future wife and the mother of his child. She posted photos of the three of them dining at five-star restaurants, eating caviar and toasting with crystal flutes of imported champagne. But the posts were not just about showing off. They were highly targeted weapons. Courtney specifically tagged my old social media handles in every single post, ensuring the notifications would flood my phone. She used passive-aggressive captions designed to maximize my emotional pain. She wrote posts about how karma always rewards the people who actually put in the work. She shared quotes about upgrading your life by leaving toxic, unmotivated failures behind. She wrote lengthy paragraphs about how Brandon was finally free to reach his full potential now that he was no longer chained to a negative dead-end partner who spent her life playing computer games in a dark basement. Beverly eagerly joined the digital harassment campaign. My own mother commented on every single photo validating their cruelty. She left comments praising Brandon for being a stellar provider and expressing her profound joy that her daughter was finally marrying a man of substance. She posted updates on her own page talking about how the universe always corrects itself and how true family is built on success and ambition, not lazy delusions. They were painting a public narrative where I was the villainous, lazy burden, and they were the triumphant heroes stepping into their rightful, opulent destiny. They wanted the entire city, their social circles, and our extended family to see my absolute defeat. They wanted me to sit in a cheap motel room, crying over their posts, feeling the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. They wanted me to be completely destroyed by their public display of victory. What they did not know was that I was not sitting in a cheap motel room. I was sitting in the expansive living room of a highly secure luxury penthouse in the center of the downtown financial district. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. I sat on a plush cream-colored sofa resting a cup of imported green tea on my lap. My phone rested on the glass coffee table in front of me, buzzing steadily with notifications from Courtney-targeted social media tags. I picked up the phone and casually scrolled through their posts. I looked at the photos of the G-Wagon, the diamond ring, the designer bags, and the expensive champagne. I read the vicious captions about karma and leaving failures behind. I read my mother glowing comments praising the man who had committed federal wire fraud. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat in my quiet, secure fortress and smiled a deep, genuine smile. I watched them eagerly, gladly walking straight into the most devastating trap imaginable. They were building a massive house of cards on a foundation of borrowed money and forged documents. Every single dollar they spent, every luxury car deposit they made, every bridge loan Brandon signed, drew the noose tighter around their own necks. They were publicly documenting their own impending ruin, providing a digital trail of their reckless spending fueled by a fortune they would never possess. They believed they were taunting a defeated woman, but they were actually performing a tragic comedy for an audience of one. They were celebrating a victory lap on a track that led directly to a cliff, and I was perfectly content to sit back, sip my tea, and watch them accelerate toward the edge. I closed the social media application and set the phone back down on the glass table. I did not need to respond to their posts. I did not need to defend myself or prove my worth to their shallow audience. Diana had advised me to maintain absolute perfect silence, and I was following her legal strategy to the letter. Every day that passed was another day their bridge loan interest compounded. Every day was another day the corporate lawyers at Apex Global gathered more evidence of Brandon forgery. Every day was another day my $39 million generated secure, legitimate interest in my offshore trust. I just had to remain a ghost, letting their own unchecked greed and boundless arrogance do all the heavy lifting for me. Let them buy the cars I thought, leaning back into the soft cushions of my penthouse sofa. Let them buy the diamonds and the designer clothes. Let them leverage every single asset they had to their names. The higher they climbed on their mountain of fraudulent debt, the harder the impact would be when gravity finally took hold. They wanted to talk about karma and upgrading their lives. They were about to learn exactly what karma looked like when it was backed by a ruthless wealth management attorney and a massive Silicon Valley legal team. I took another slow sip of my tea, enjoying the profound, peaceful silence of my new life, while the architects of my past eagerly engineered their own absolute destruction. The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended high above the chaotic noise of the city. I spent my mornings standing by the massive windows watching the tiny cars navigate the busy intersections far below. My new life was entirely invisible to the people who had tried to destroy me. To Brandon, Courtney, and Beverly, I was a pathetic ghost, haunting the cheap motels on the outskirts of the city. They firmly believed I was surviving on vending machine food and crying myself to sleep on a stained mattress. I did nothing to correct that narrative. I ordered my groceries through a private delivery service and spent my days exercising in the private gym. I relished the safety of my absolute anonymity. While my family paraded their fraudulent wealth across every social platform they could find, I remained a master class in restraint. I knew true power did not need an audience. The trust held my $39 million securely. I was completely financially invincible, yet I played the defeated victim flawlessly. The illusion of my total ruin was tested on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my secure cell phone vibrated on the marble kitchen counter. I glanced at the caller identification and saw my mother name flashing on the screen. Beverly had not contacted me directly since the day she handed me those divorce papers in my former kitchen. I let it ring 3 times before pressing accept, holding the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I waited, listening to the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Beverly did not bother with pleasantries or fake maternal concern. She launched immediately into a cold, calculated attack. She told me that she had been reviewing her old financial records and noticed an outstanding discrepancy. She claimed that 5 years ago, when I first started my freelance coding career, she had given me a $2,000 family loan to help cover my server hosting costs. She demanded the loan be repaid in full by the end of the day. The audacity of the request was absolutely staggering. 5 years ago, she had handed me a check for $2,000 and explicitly called it an early birthday gift. She had told me she wanted to support my little computer hobby. Now she was weaponizing that gift, transforming it into a strict financial obligation simply to inflict maximum pain. She knew Brandon had left me with exactly $500. She knew I had no steady income and no assets. Demanding $2,000 was absolutely not about retrieving lost capital. Beverly and Courtney were currently spending tens of thousands of dollars a day on designer handbags and luxury car deposits. $2,000 was absolute pocket change to the imaginary fortune they believed they possessed. This unexpected phone call was purely about cruelty. It was a calculated move designed to back me into a corner, humiliate me, and force me to beg for mercy. She wanted to hear the raw desperation in my voice and revel in my absolute inability to pay her back. Beverly's voice dripped with poisonous condescension as she continued her tirade over the phone. She told me that Courtney needed the money for the nursery renovations and that it was completely unfair for me to hold on to family funds when I was no longer part of the family. She suggested that if I could not afford to pay it back, I should consider getting a job at a fast food restaurant instead of pretending to be a software developer. She even mocked my living situation, stating she hoped the cheap motel I was staying in had reliable internet so I could process the bank transfer. I kept my breathing slow and measured, refusing to give her a single ounce of the emotional reaction she craved. I told her I needed to check my finances and would call her right back. I hung up the phone, cutting off her arrogant laughter, and immediately dialed Diana's private number. I explained the situation to my wealth management attorney, detailing the petty demand and the malicious intent behind it. Diana listened to the entire story without interrupting. When I finished the story, she let out a sharp, appreciative laugh. She told me that this petty demand was actually the greatest strategic gift Beverly could have possibly handed us. Diana explained the psychology of hostile litigation and wealth concealment. She told me that if I fought the demand or begged for more time, Beverly and Brandon might start asking questions about how I was surviving. They might decide to dig into my current financial status, just to torment me further. We could not risk them accidentally stumbling upon the offshore trust or the truth about the Apex Global buyout before the trap was fully sprung. Diana instructed me to pay the $2,000 immediately. She told me to transfer it directly from the secure domestic allowance account linked to my encrypted debit card. Paying the money without a fight would cement their absolute delusion. It would convince them that they had successfully squeezed the very last drop of blood from my lifeless financial corpse. I understood the brilliance of Diana's strategy immediately. Submitting to Beverly's cruel demand would serve as the ultimate camouflage for my massive wealth. I calmly opened my highly secure banking application and swiftly initiated a direct wire transfer to my mother account for exactly $2,000. I did not add a note or a message. I simply executed the transaction and watched the funds leave my allowance account. A few minutes later, my phone lit up with a barrage of text messages. The financial transfer had gone through perfectly, and the reaction was absolutely instantaneous. Beverly texted me a single thumbs-up emoji, followed by a message telling me that it was good to see I was finally taking some personal responsibility for my failures. Courtney quickly followed up with a text of her own, telling me to enjoy living on the streets now that my last dime was gone. They were gloating, celebrating their petty victory with absolute vicious delight. They truly believed they had completely destroyed me and my financial future entirely. I set my mobile phone down on the marble counter and smiled. I felt a profound sense of empowerment knowing that the $2,000 I had just sent them was literally less than the interest my trust account generated while I was drinking my morning coffee. Their sheer arrogance had completely blinded them to reality. They were so utterly convinced of their own superiority and my inherent weakness that they could not see the massive storm gathering directly above their heads. By paying the money, I had effectively locked the door to their delusion and thrown away the key. They would continue to spend Brandon fraudulent bridge loans with reckless abandon, completely certain that no one was coming to stop them. They would continue to post their fake luxury lifestyle online, digging a deeper hole with every single credit card swipe. I had purchased my absolute privacy and their continued ignorance for the incredibly low price of $2,000. It was arguably the best financial investment I had ever made in my life. With my highly toxic family successfully distracted by their own petty cruelty, I quickly turned my attention to the future. I walked out of the kitchen and entered the sprawling home office I had set up in the penthouse. The large room was equipped with three massive high-definition monitors, a custom-built processing tower, and a wall of whiteboards covered completely in complex architectural diagrams. I was not just hiding in this luxury fortress waiting for Brandon Empire to collapse, I was actively building my very own. The $39 million from Apex Global was not just a settlement, it was seed capital. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my computer screens. For the past 3 weeks, I had been working tirelessly with Diana and a team of elite corporate attorneys to establish the legal framework for my new company. I was launching a dedicated technology firm focused entirely on creating advanced accessibility software for enterprise-level operating systems. The sheer momentum I was building was absolutely unstoppable. The heavy corporate paperwork sat in a neat, organized stack on my wooden desk, awaiting my final signature. I picked up my favorite pen and quickly signed the critical articles of incorporation, officially bringing Lumina Tech Solutions into existence. I was no longer a freelance developer, working out of a damp basement, relying on a deceitful husband to handle the business logistics. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a fully funded technology firm with a massive capital reserve and an impeccable industry reputation, courtesy of the Apex Global acquisition. I had already begun recruiting top-tier engineering talent, offering highly competitive salaries and remote work flexibility to build my initial development team. I was securing commercial office space in the most prestigious tech hub in the city, negotiating lease terms with the confidence of a woman who could buy the entire building in cash if she chose to. I was turning the trauma of my past into the solid foundation of an unstoppable corporate empire that would permanently redefine my entire future. I carefully reviewed the initial product roadmaps and strategic deployment schedules, mapping out the next 12 critical months of software development. I was expanding on the core concepts of my original plugin, designing a comprehensive suite of accessibility tools that would revolutionize how disabled users interacted with digital environments. The work was demanding, complex, and incredibly fulfilling. Every line of code I reviewed, every business strategy I finalized, felt like a definitive step away from the toxic shadow of my family. I was channeling all the energy I had once wasted trying to earn my mother approval into building something that actually mattered. I did not need Beverly validation or Brandon fake support anymore. I was entirely self-sufficient, armed with undeniable genius, and fortified by tens of millions of dollars. I worked late into the evening, fueled by espresso and sheer unrelenting ambition, listening to the quiet hum of my powerful servers. My arrogant family was busy digging their own graves while I was actively building a beautiful future that would outlast them all. The illusion of Brandon absolute victory shattered on a Tuesday morning exactly 28 days after he had kicked me out of our home. It started with a single phone call from the predatory lending firm that had financed his $5 million bridge loan. The initial 30-day grace period for the aggressive high-interest advance had officially expired, and the primary creditors were aggressively demanding their first massive repayment installment. Brandon sat in his home office staring at his Horizon Tech Solutions banking portal. The screen displayed a pathetic balance of just under $3,000. The $39 million wire transfer from Apex Global was still entirely missing. The deep, gnawing sensation of genuine panic finally began to claw at the edges of his immense ego. He ignored the ringing phone and frantically logged into his email, searching for any communication from the corporate acquisition team. There was absolutely nothing. No updates, no delays, no confirmations. The silence from Silicon Valley was utterly deafening. Brandon poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, his hands trembling violently as the amber liquid splashed over the heavy crystal rim. The lenders did not stop calling, By noon, they had resorted to sending increasingly threatening emails outlining the immediate aggressive seizure of all collateral assets. The list of threatened assets included the house, the newly purchased luxury vehicles, and his personal checking accounts. Brandon was completely cornered. He could no longer hide behind the comforting delusion of administrative delays or banking holidays. He needed answers immediately before his entire fabricated life was permanently repossessed by angry debt collectors. Desperation overrode his usual calculated caution. Brandon bypassed the automated email system and directly called the main legal department at Apex Global. He loudly demanded to speak with the senior acquisition director handling the Horizon Tech Solutions buyout. He fully expected to easily bully a junior associate into pushing the paperwork through the system. Instead, his call was aggressively routed to a senior corporate litigator named Richard Caldwell. Brandon aggressively demanded his money, loudly claiming an immediate breach of contract. Richard Caldwell did not raise his voice. He spoke with the terrifying clinical precision of a man who held absolute limitless power. Richard calmly informed Brandon that Apex Global had officially terminated all communication with Horizon Tech Solutions 3 weeks prior. Brandon felt the warm blood rapidly drain from his face, leaving him feeling cold and dizzy. He stammered weakly, asking how a signed acquisition contract could possibly be terminated without formal legal notice. Richard delivered the fatal blow without a single ounce of professional mercy. He explained that their forensic accounting division had conducted routine due diligence on the original software transfer documents. They utilized advanced cryptographic verification and definitively proved that the signature belonging to the original creator had been maliciously and sloppily forged. Horizon Tech Solutions did not legally own the software and therefore had absolutely no legal standing in the acquisition process. Brandon's vision went completely dark around the edges. He gripped the edge of his wooden desk, struggling to draw a full breath into his constricting lungs. He desperately tried to backtrack, his tone shifting from arrogant demands to pathetic pleading. He claimed it was just a minor clerical error and that he could easily get his wife to sign new updated paperwork by the end of the day. Richard cut him off instantly. He informed Brandon that securing new paperwork would not be necessary under any circumstances. To avoid acquiring stolen intellectual property and facing a catastrophic multi-million-dollar lawsuit, Apex Global had entirely bypassed the fraudulent holding company. Richard stated clearly that the full $39 million buyout had already been successfully wired directly to the verified original patent holder. He clearly stated my name. The phone slipped from Brandon's sweaty fingers and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. The horrific reality of his situation crushed him like a massive physical weight. He had not just lost the money. He had committed federal wire fraud and blatant forgery against one of the largest tech conglomerates on the planet. He was facing total, absolute financial ruin and a highly probable federal prison sentence. And the tens of millions of dollars he desperately needed to save himself were currently sitting securely in the bank account of the woman he had completely destroyed. Absolute terror rapidly transformed into frantic, desperate action. Brandon knew he was completely out of viable options. His only chance of survival was to manipulate me into signing over the funds before his aggressive creditors seized his entire life and the federal authorities knocked on his front door. He arrogantly assumed I was still a naive, broken woman crying in a cheap motel room, completely unaware of the massive fortunes sitting in my personal bank account. He hired an expensive underground skip tracer, using the very last of his available high-interest credit to track my current physical location. The skip tracer could not penetrate my offshore trust or discover my secure luxury penthouse lease. But they did manage to locate the commercial office space I had recently leased for Lumina Tech Solutions. Brandon ran out of his house and jumped into his heavily financed Porsche. He drove across town, recklessly breaking multiple traffic laws in his frantic, desperate rush to reach me before his world collapsed. He parked illegally outside the sleek, modern glass building in the busy financial district and paced the concrete sidewalk, waiting anxiously for me to emerge. He meticulously rehearsed his performance, adjusting his posture to appear appropriately devastated, remorseful, and entirely broken. I walked out of the corporate lobby at precisely 1 o'clock, heading toward my favorite upscale cafe for a quick lunch. I was calmly reviewing a digital wireframe on my tablet, completely focused on the future of my new company. Suddenly, a heavy hand caught my arm, spinning me around. I turned and found Brandon standing there looking incredibly disheveled and frantic. His expensive designer suit was deeply wrinkled, and his eyes were wild with unfiltered, raw desperation. He immediately launched into the most pathetic, manipulative performance I had ever witnessed in my entire life. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the busy downtown sidewalk, completely ignoring the curious stares of passing corporate executives and pedestrians. "Melanie, please, you have to listen to me," he begged, his voice cracking loudly with fabricated emotional pain. He reached out, grabbed my hand, and tried to press it against his tear-stained cheek. I made the biggest mistake of my entire life. I was confused and stressed, and Courtney manipulated me. She took complete advantage of my temporary vulnerability. I never truly loved her, Melanie. I only ever loved you. I was an absolute fool to let you walk out that door. I stared down at the man kneeling on the dirty concrete, feeling absolutely nothing but profound clinical disgust. I forcefully pulled my hand away from his sweaty grip and took a deliberate, measured step back. Brandon refused to stop his frantic, desperate monologue. Fake tears were actually forming in his eyes as he aggressively attempted to play the tragic victim. He loudly claimed that he had kicked Courtney out of the house that exact morning, throwing his pregnant new wife completely under the bus in a pathetic attempt to save his own skin. He begged me to come back home, promising that we could start over and forget the past month ever happened. He insisted that we made a brilliant, unstoppable team and that we could equally share everything we had built together over the years. He talked endlessly about our wonderful shared future, entirely failing to mention the $39 million he desperately needed to steal from me to pay off his massive fraudulent debts. He was betting his entire existence on my supposed emotional weakness. He incorrectly assumed I was still so desperate for his validation that I would blindly welcome him back and happily hand over my entire tech fortune. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for me to crumble into his arms and save him. His performance was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, but it was entirely wasted on me. I watched him scramble and beg, noting how quickly he was willing to discard Courtney the moment she was no longer useful to his grand financial scheme. He continued to grovel on the sidewalk, promising me the world, while secretly plotting to rob me blind. The sheer, arrogant audacity of his pathetic plan was almost comical. He truly believed he could easily charm his way out of federal wire fraud and absolute financial ruin simply by offering me a few fake tears, empty promises, and a completely hollow, predictable apology. He reached out again desperately, trying to grab the bottom hem of my perfectly tailored suit jacket, his cold fingers trembling with absolute terror as he waited eagerly for my final response. I looked down at his trembling fingers gripping the expensive fabric of my suit jacket. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man sobbing on the concrete. I felt absolutely nothing. My face remained a perfectly blank mask of cold indifference. I did not bend down to comfort him. I did not offer him a warm smile or a shoulder to cry on. I simply stared at him, letting the pathetic silence stretch out between us. Brandon continued his theatrical performance for another full minute, squeezing his eyes shut and attempting to force out more fake tears. When he finally realized that I was not reacting, that I was not falling to my knees to join him in his fabricated emotional breakdown, his entire demeanor shifted. The desperate, pleading husband vanished in an instant. The fake tears dried up completely. His grip on my jacket loosened and he slowly stood up, dusting the city grime off his wrinkled trousers. The mask of remorse slipped off, revealing the arrogant, narcissistic bully I had tolerated for 6 long years. Brandon let out a harsh, frustrated sigh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He glared at me, his eyes narrowing with bitter resentment. He told me I was making a massive mistake playing hard to get. He claimed he was offering me a lifeline out of the sheer goodness of his heart, and that I was too stupid and prideful to take it. He aggressively stepped into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, the way he had done so many times in our dark basement. He told me that Courtney was already driving him crazy, and that he was willing to throw her out just to bring some peace and quiet back into his life. He demanded I stop acting like a tough corporate executive and remember my actual place. He told me I was a broke college dropout who needed him to survive, and that playing this silent game of resistance was pathetic. I maintained my ground, refusing to step back or break eye contact. My complete lack of fear deeply unsettled him, but his towering ego quickly overrode his brief hesitation. If the romantic seduction angle was not going to work, he was entirely prepared to pivot to financial brute force. Brandon reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal envelope. He slapped it against his palm, a cruel, predatory smile spreading across his face. He told me that since I wanted to be difficult, he was going to make this a pure business transaction. He declared that he was completely done dealing with my stubborn attitude and just wanted to finalize the divorce immediately so he could move on with his highly successful life. He opened the envelope and pulled out a freshly printed legal document, shoving it toward my chest. Brandon proudly announced that this was an updated, expedited divorce settlement. He claimed his lawyers had drafted it that very morning. He told me he was willing to be incredibly generous despite my terrible attitude. He offered me a one-time lump sum payment of $50,000 to sign the document right there on the busy sidewalk. He boasted that $50,000 was more money than a failed freelance developer like me would see in a decade. He painted the offer as an act of profound charity, telling me it would keep me out of cheap motels for a few years if I budgeted properly. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and clicked it, demanding I sign the bottom line immediately to secure my financial lifeline. He insisted that if I walked away from this generous offer, he would make sure I ended up completely destitute, fighting a ruthless legal battle I could never afford. I did not reach for the pen. I did not even look at the piece of paper he was forcefully shoving into my personal space. I knew exactly what that document was. My elite wealth management attorney Diana had anticipated this precise maneuver. She had warned me that a desperate cornered animal would always try to bite its way out of a trap. She had explicitly coached me on the legal mechanics of Brandon impending panic. Hidden deep within the dense, complicated legal jargon of that updated settlement was a highly predatory clause. By signing that paper for $50,000, I would be retroactively transferring all of my intellectual property rights directly to him. The document contained specific language that would legally forfeit any past, present, or future financial payouts associated with my accessibility software plugin. It was a desperate, frantic attempt to legally secure the Apex Global buyout funds before his fraudulent empire completely collapsed. He wanted my signature to validate his forgery and save him from federal prison. I looked Brandon dead in the eyes and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. I told him he was insulting my intelligence. I told him I knew exactly what was buried on page 7 of that settlement. I explicitly mentioned the retroactive intellectual property transfer clause. I watched the blood instantly drain from his face for the second time that day. His arrogant, confident sneer vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He could not comprehend how I knew about the clause. He could not understand how the broke, defeated woman he had kicked out of his house possessed the legal acumen to instantly identify his highly classified corporate trap. I did not give him a single second to recover from his shock. I reached into my own designer leather handbag. I bypassed my encrypted debit card and pulled out a thick, heavy-bound legal folder featuring the immaculate crest of Diana Elite Wealth Management Firm. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and forcefully pressed the heavy folder directly into his chest. Brandon instinctively brought his hands up to grab the folder, dropping his own fraudulent settlement papers onto the dirty concrete sidewalk. I looked at him with absolute unwavering authority and delivered the fatal blow. I told him he had just been officially served. Brandon stared down at the thick legal portfolio in his hands, his eyes wide and panicked. He asked me what this was, his voice trembling uncontrollably. I told him exactly what it was. I informed him that my legal team was filing a comprehensive, devastating civil lawsuit against him and his shell company. I clearly articulated the exact charges, leaving absolutely no room for misunderstanding. I told him he was being sued for malicious intellectual property theft, deliberate signature forgery, and extensive federal wire fraud. I explained that we were coming after him for full financial restitution regarding the 4 years of secret lucrative royalties he had illegally collected from Apex Global behind my back. The mention of Apex Global struck him like a bolt of lightning. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to shift his weight to keep from collapsing onto the sidewalk a second time. He looked up at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching my face for any sign that this was a bluff. He asked me how I knew about the tech company. He stammered wildly, demanding to know who I had been talking to. He tried to claim that Horizon Tech Solutions was a completely separate, legitimate business venture that had absolutely nothing to do with my failed software project. He was drowning in his own lies, desperately trying to tread water in a storm that had already swallowed him whole. I maintained my relentless, aggressive posture. I told him his pathetic lies were completely useless now. I informed him that the aggressive corporate acquisition lawyers at Apex Global had contacted me directly. I watched his soul completely leave his body as I revealed that the corporate attorneys had easily identified his sloppy amateur signature forgery during their rigorous due diligence phase. I explained that they had completely frozen his holding company out of the multi-million-dollar acquisition process to avoid acquiring stolen intellectual property. I made sure he understood that his master plan was dead and that his massive financial payday was never going to arrive in his bank account. Brandon began to hyperventilate. He clutched the legal folder to his chest as if it were a physical shield against the incoming destruction. He begged me to stop the lawsuit. He promised he would give me half of the buyout money if I just called my lawyers off and signed a new licensing agreement to legitimize his transaction. He claimed we could both walk away incredibly rich and never have to see each other again. He was bargaining with imaginary money, attempting to trade chips he did not even possess. I leaned in close so only he could hear my next words over the ambient noise of the busy city street. I told him he had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. I explained with brutal surgical precision that the corporate lawyers at Apex Global had bypassed his fraudulent shell company completely. I told him they had wired the full $39 million buyout directly into my personal secure bank account over a month ago. I let the staggering truth wash over him, watching his mind desperately try to process the fact that I already possessed the vast fortune he was currently leveraging his entire life against. I told him I knew all about his massive high-interest bridge loans. I knew he had put down massive cash deposits on luxury cars he could not actually afford. I knew he had completely leveraged my former house as collateral for a predatory cash advance he had zero ability to repay. I laid out his entire disastrous financial reality, making sure he fully grasped the inescapable totality of his impending ruin. He had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of aggressive fraud, and I had just gleefully pulled out the bottom row. Brandon stood completely paralyzed on the sidewalk, tears of genuine terrifying panic streaming down his face. He finally understood that he had played a high-stakes game of chess against an opponent he brutally underestimated. He realized he was not the mastermind he believed himself to be. He was just a pathetic, predictable criminal who had eagerly sprinted directly into a flawlessly executed legal trap. I turned my back on my trembling, terrified ex-husband and walked calmly back into my corporate building, leaving him to face the total annihilation of his own making. As I walked through the sleek, revolving glass doors of my corporate lobby, I did not look back. I knew exactly what Brandon was doing. He was standing on the busy sidewalk, staring at the thick legal folder in his hands, realizing that every single choice he had made over the last 6 years had led him directly to federal prison. He had traded a loyal, brilliant wife for a shallow, manipulative sister. He had traded a secure, comfortable life for a fraudulent, temporary illusion of immense wealth. He had arrogantly believed that because I was quiet, because I preferred the solitude of my coding environment, to the loud, boastful arrogance of his social circle, that I was inherently weak. He had fatally confused my introversion with stupidity. The truth was that I had spent years analyzing complex systems, identifying critical vulnerabilities, and writing elegant, unbreakable code to fix them. When Brandon made himself the critical vulnerability in my life, I simply applied that exact same analytical precision to dismantle him. I had allowed him to exhaust his energy performing his pathetic seduction routine, knowing it would rapidly devolve into his true bullying nature. I had let him present his predatory $50,000 settlement because it provided the ultimate undeniable proof of his malicious intent. Every desperate move he made today only strengthened my legal case against him. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I stepped into the private executive elevator. It was a secure message from Diana confirming that Brandon, predatory lenders had officially filed emergency injunctions against his holding company due to his missed payments. The dominoes were falling exactly according to our meticulously designed legal strategy. Brandon was now fighting a horrific two-front war. He was facing my devastating civil lawsuit for intellectual property theft and fraud, while simultaneously battling ruthless corporate debt collectors who were actively seizing his leveraged assets. He had no money, no legal defense, and absolutely no way out. I pressed the button for my penthouse office floor, watching the floor numbers climb higher and higher. I felt a profound sense of absolute vindication. Brandon's attempt to bully me into signing away my life work had been the final pathetic gasp of a dying tyrant. He had tried to offer me a microscopic fraction of my own wealth, acting as a benevolent savior, while secretly plotting my total ruin. Instead, I had handed him the blueprint of his own absolute destruction. I stepped out of the elevator and walked toward my corner office, ready to finalize the launch of Lumina Tech Solutions. I had successfully defended my empire, and the real work was just beginning. Brandon stood rooted to the concrete outside the towering glass facade of Melanie Corporate Building. The heavy legal portfolio in his hands felt like a ticking explosive device. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as the sheer magnitude of his impending destruction finally crushed through his immense ego. He was not just a man who had lost a fortune. He was a man staring directly down the barrel of a federal indictment. Wire fraud, intellectual property theft, malicious forgery. The words printed on the pristine legal documents blurred together as a cold sweat broke out across his neck. If the authorities raided his home office and seized his hard drives, they would find the clumsy digital traces of the forged signatures and the fake LLC documents he had submitted to Apex Global. He was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. He stumbled back to his illegally parked Porsche, collapsing into the driver's seat. His phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder. It was a restricted number. The aggressive collection agency representing his bridge loan financiers had been calling him every 20 minutes since dawn. He had completely leveraged this car, the suburban house, and all his future earnings against a $39 million payout that was never going to arrive. He silenced the phone, his hands trembling so badly he could barely grip the leather steering wheel. He needed time. If he could just keep up the illusion of immense wealth for a few more days, he might find a sleazy defense attorney who could discover a microscopic loophole in Melanie Offshore Trust. He convinced himself that applying enough public pressure might force her to settle out of court just to make him go away. Brandon drove back to the suburban house operating entirely on pure adrenaline and blind panic. When he walked through the front door, the stark contrast between his internal terror and the atmosphere in the living room was incredibly jarring. The house was overflowing with massive shopping bags, designer dress boxes, and towering floral arrangements. Courtney and Beverly were sitting at the kitchen island, surrounded by glossy catering menus and expensive fabric swatches. They were in the final stages of planning the most extravagant engagement and baby shower the local country club had ever seen. The party was scheduled for the upcoming weekend, and they had invited over 200 of the wealthiest, most influential socialites in the city. Courtney looked up from a velvet-bound guest list, her massive 6-carat diamond ring catching the kitchen lighting. She asked Brandon why he looked so pale, complaining that he was ruining the celebratory mood. Brandon forced his facial muscles into a stiff, unconvincing smile. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and lied with every ounce of arrogant charm he had left. He told them he was simply exhausted from dealing with the tedious corporate accountants at Apex Global. He claimed the massive wire transfer required a few extra layers of executive signatures due to international tax regulations, but assured them the money was absolutely secured. He told Courtney she looked beautiful and kissed her cheek, fighting the intense urge to vomit. Beverly narrowed her eyes slightly, holding up a catering invoice for $15,000. She asked if they should delay the final vendor payments until the cash actually hit the checking account. Panic flared hot and bright in Brandon's chest. If they canceled the vendors, people would start asking questions. His creditors would smell blood in the water. He needed to maintain the absolute facade of a billionaire tech mogul to keep his desperate house of cards standing. He aggressively dismissed Beverly's concern, pulling out his maxed-out high-limit credit card and tossing it onto the marble island. He ordered them to pay every single vendor in full and upgrade the champagne packages to the most expensive vintage available. He loudly insisted that this party was going to be the absolute crowning achievement of their new social status. Courtney squealed with delight, eagerly snatching the credit card and returning to her opulent planning. Brandon excused himself, claiming he needed to take an urgent call with his wealth management team. He locked himself in his home office and collapsed into his desk chair. The moment the door clicked shut, his confident facade completely melted away, leaving only raw, unadulterated terror. He frantically opened his laptop and began searching for ruthless defense attorneys who specialized in high-stakes intellectual property theft and federal fraud. He called 3 different law firms, pitching his fabricated story about a vindictive ex-wife trying to steal his legitimate corporate buyout. Every single attorney he spoke to asked for a massive, upfront retainer, citing the extreme complexity of fighting a fully funded offshore trust. Brandon did not have $50,000 to secure a legal retainer. He barely had enough available credit to buy basic groceries. The walls of his home office felt like they were physically closing in on him. His email inbox pinged with a new urgent message. It was an official default notice from the bridge loan financiers, explicitly stating that emergency repossession injunctions were being filed. They were actively coming for the Porsche, the expensive designer jewelry, and the house. Brandon stared at the default notice, his vision blurring with hot tears of absolute panic. He could hear Courtney and Beverly laughing wildly in the kitchen, eagerly discussing exactly how jealous Melanie would be when she saw the beautiful photos from their upcoming country club party. He gripped his desk, his mind fracturing entirely under the immense, unyielding pressure. He decided to double down. He would attend the massive shower play, the triumphant wealthy provider, and corner Melanie publicly. He deluded himself into believing that threatening to drag her new corporate reputation through the mud would eventually break her resolve completely. He adjusted his wrinkled suit, preparing to eagerly march his entire arrogant family directly into an inescapable public slaughter. The Oakmont Country Club was a sprawling monument to extreme wealth and desperate social climbing, making it the absolute perfect venue for the grand illusion my family had constructed. The prestigious grand ballroom had been completely transformed into a grotesque and staggering display of unearned opulence. Massive, intricate ice sculptures, shaped like soaring swans, guarded the mahogany entrances, slowly melting under the heat of heavy imported crystal chandeliers. Highly trained waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated continuously through the massive crowd, carrying heavy silver trays, offering imported beluga caviar and endless glasses of top-tier vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played a soft, elegant melody in the far corner, but their music was completely drowned out by the shrill, forced laughter of the 200 wealthy guests who had been invited strictly to witness this fabricated triumph. Courtney stood proudly at the absolute center of the grand ballroom, acting as the undisputed queen of the evening. She was wearing a custom-tailored white silk gown that clung perfectly to her remarkably flat stomach, projecting the image of a glowing, expectant mother. She held court among a large group of influential socialites and wealthy country club wives, aggressively waving her left hand during every single sentence to ensure her massive 6-carat emerald-cut diamond caught the bright overhead lighting. She loudly and confidently recounted the completely fabricated story of Brandon's massive corporate buyout. She claimed he was a brilliant, unparalleled visionary who had single-handedly revolutionized the modern tech industry with his coding genius. She lied with such practiced natural ease that the guests hung on to her every word, expressing their awe and intense jealousy. Beverly hovered right beside her favorite daughter, radiating a highly toxic, predatory pride. She wore a completely unpaid-for designer gown that cost more than my first car, and she spoke with the condescending, arrogant drawl of a woman who believed she had finally conquered the elite social hierarchy. She eagerly cornered her wealthy friends, boasting relentlessly about her new incoming wealth and making sure to explicitly mention how Brandon had finally dropped his deadweight wife to be with a woman of actual substance. Beverly's voice echoed shrilly across the ballroom, carrying over the classical music and the clinking glasses. She was deliberately entertaining her audience with highly exaggerated malicious tales of my supposed utter demise. Beverly loudly claimed that I was currently living in a squalid, dangerous motel on the edge of town, begging for basic handouts, and completely unable to cope with my own catastrophic personal failures. She told the captivated guests that I had dropped out of college because I lacked the basic intellectual capacity to succeed in the real world, and that my pathetic attempts at software coding were nothing more than a desperate, sad plea for attention. Courtney eagerly chimed in, leaning toward the gossiping women and laughing sharply as she told them that some people are simply born to be stepping stones for actual winners. They were completely intoxicated by their own malicious lies, feeding ravenously off the shocked gasps and sympathetic murmurs of their wealthy captive audience. They truly believed they were untouchable, standing at the very pinnacle of high society. While Courtney and Beverly reveled in their fraudulent glory, Brandon stood near the crowded open bar, sweating profusely through his expensive tailored suit. He gripped a heavy crystal tumbler of dark whiskey, tossing the burning liquid back with terrifying, chaotic speed. His secure smartphone vibrated violently in his suit pocket every few minutes. Each aggressive buzz was another automated default alert from his ruthless bridge loan creditors, informing him of impending asset seizures. He forced a rigid, terrifying smile onto his face whenever a guest approached to congratulate him on his corporate success, nodding mechanically while his internal reality completely collapsed into dust. He felt like a condemned man standing directly on a trapdoor, waiting for the executioner to pull the heavy lever. Brandon kept glancing nervously toward the grand entrance, desperately hoping to figure out a way to escape the impending public slaughter he had orchestrated for himself. His chest heaved with quiet, suppressed panic attacks. He knew the massive catering bills, the floral arrangements, and the designer clothes were all charged to credit accounts that were currently defaulting. He watched Courtney order another bottle of exclusive champagne for her friends, his stomach twisting into violent knots. He wanted to scream at them to stop spending money he did not have, but he was entirely paralyzed by his own massive ego and the paralyzing fear of federal prison. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, forced to smile and drink while the walls closed in tight around him. Outside the prestigious country club, the weather was crisp and clear. The heavy wrought iron gates of the exclusive property swung open to admit a vehicle that immediately commanded the attention of every single valet on duty. A sleek, pristine black Maybach glided smoothly up the circular brick driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the warm glow of the estate exterior lighting. The vehicle rolled to a silent, perfect stop, directly in front of the grand mahogany entrance doors. The head valet rushed forward, his white-gloved hands reaching out to pull the heavy passenger door open. He expected a high-profile celebrity or a massive corporate titan to step out onto the plush red carpet rolling down the steps. I stepped out of the luxurious vehicle and my polished designer heels clicked sharply against the pavement. I did not look like a broke, defeated college dropout living in a cheap motel. I did not look like a woman who had been thrown out of her home with exactly $500 to her name. I looked like absolute refined power. I was wearing an impeccably tailored high-end midnight blue designer suit that hugged my frame with sharp, aggressive lines. The fabric was immaculate, radiating a quiet, undeniable wealth that made the flashy logos and unpaid-for gowns inside look incredibly cheap by comparison. My hair was styled in a sleek, flawless blowout, and my makeup was sharp, calculated, and totally unyielding. I carried a single, elegant leather clutch that contained all the legal documentation necessary to burn their entire fabricated world straight to the ground. I did not rush. I walked up the wide stone steps with the measured, confident stride of a woman who literally owned everything in her path. The valets and club staff respectfully stepped aside, lowering their heads slightly as I passed through the heavy mahogany doors and into the grand lobby. The air inside the lobby was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and high-end perfumes. I could hear the loud thumping bass of the party music and the chaotic roar of 200 guests celebrating a lie. I walked directly toward the massive double doors leading into the grand ballroom. Two uniformed attendants hurried to pull the heavy doors open for me, their eyes wide with respect for the undeniable aura of authority I projected. The heavy doors swung open, revealing the grotesque spectacle inside. I stepped over the threshold and into the grand ballroom, my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high. I did not sneak in quietly or try to blend into the background. I walked directly onto the polished dance floor, placing myself directly in the center of the massive room. I locked my cold, indifferent gaze onto the exact spot where Beverly and Courtney were standing holding their champagne flutes and laughing at my expense. The effect was absolutely instantaneous. A guest standing near the entrance noticed me first and stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. The woman next to him turned to follow his gaze, and she too froze completely. The reaction rippled across the massive ballroom like a sudden violent shockwave. The loud, boisterous conversations began to die out in rapid succession. People nudged their partners, pointing silently in my direction. The guests who had just been listening to Beverly malicious stories about my supposed homelessness stared in absolute shock at the stunning, powerful woman standing before them. The stark, undeniable contrast between the pathetic loser Beverly had described and the immaculate multimillionaire standing in the room was physically jarring. The sudden wave of silence swept through the entire venue, absorbing the laughter, the clinking glasses, and the superficial chatter. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire event. Even the string quartet in the corner, sensing the massive shift in the room atmosphere, awkwardly allowed their music to trail off into nothingness. The entire grand ballroom fell completely dead silent. 200 pairs of eyes were locked directly on me, completely mesmerized and entirely shocked by my transformation and my undeniable commanding presence. I stood perfectly still, letting the crushing heavy silence suffocate the room, waiting patiently for my family to finally turn around and see exactly what kind of monster they had created. The air felt completely electric, charged with the undeniable absolute promise of their rapid and total destruction. The heavy silence hanging over the grand ballroom finally broke when Beverly pushed her way to the front of the crowd. The absolute shock on my mother's face rapidly morphed into a twisted mask of violent outrage. She could not comprehend how the broken woman she had discarded was now standing before her, radiating absolute power and undeniable wealth. Beverly marched directly across the polished dance floor, her designer heels stomping aggressively against the hardwood. She stopped inches from my face, her eyes practically bulging out of her head with raw, unchecked fury. She immediately began screaming at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her carefully crafted high society persona. She demanded to know what I was doing crashing this private event, calling me a pathetic, jealous failure who could not stand to see my younger sister finally get the life she deserved. Beverly frantically waved her hands, signaling for the country club security guards stationed near the entrance. She loudly ordered them to grab me and throw me out, claiming I was an unstable trespasser trying to ruin a beautiful celebration. The security guards took a few hesitant steps forward, but stopped completely in their tracks when I leveled a cold, razor-sharp glare at them. They recognized the undeniable authority in my posture and the expensive tailoring of my midnight blue suit. They saw a woman who looked like she could buy the entire country club and fire everyone in it. Courtney rushed up beside our mother, eager to join the public humiliation. My younger sister sneered, her face twisted with profound arrogance. She aggressively thrust her left hand directly into my personal space, waving her massive 6-carat emerald-cut diamond ring right in front of my eyes. She laughed a sharp, mocking sound, telling me I was absolutely delusional if I thought putting on a nice suit would change the fact that I was a complete loser. She loudly bragged that Brandon had bought her this flawless diamond because she was actually worth it, and that I was just a bitter, jealous ex-wife desperately trying to steal her spotlight. I did not flinch or react to the massive diamond she was shoving in my face. I knew with absolute certainty that the diamond was completely unpaid for, entirely financed by a predatory bridge loan that was currently defaulting. I looked at Courtney and then at Beverly, letting a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I did not say a single word. Instead, I stepped smoothly around my mother, brushing past her rigid shoulder, and walked deliberately toward the elevated stage, where the string quartet had been playing. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Wealthy socialites and influential business owners stepped back, giving me a wide, clear path to the stage. They were completely captivated by the intense drama unfolding before their eyes. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps and stood directly behind the elegant microphone stand. The string quartet musicians had wisely retreated to the back of the stage, leaving me in absolute command of the entire room. I reached out and tapped the microphone once. The sharp electronic thud echoed loudly through the massive ballroom, commanding the immediate, undivided attention of every single person present. I adjusted the microphone stand to my height, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. I looked out over the sea of faces, locating Brandon near the open bar. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a steep, terrifying cliff, his face completely devoid of color, his hands gripping a crystal tumbler so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He knew his entire fabricated empire was about to be burned to the ground. I took a deep, steady breath and leaned into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice ringing clear and perfectly calm through the state-of-the-art sound system. I apologize for interrupting this lavish celebration, but I felt it was incredibly important to clarify exactly what you are all celebrating here tonight. My mother, Beverly, and my sister, Courtney, have spent the last month telling you a fascinating story about a massive corporate tech buyout. They have told you that Brandon is a brilliant software visionary who recently sold his company for tens of millions of dollars. They have painted a beautiful picture of sudden extreme wealth and unlimited success. I paused, letting my words sink into the silent, captivated crowd. I locked eyes with Brandon, watching his chest heave with suppressed panic. "It is a highly entertaining story." I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, dangerous level. "But it is entirely fabricated. Brandon did not create any software. He is not a tech visionary. The accessibility software plugin that sparked this massive corporate interest was entirely designed, coded, and built by me. I spent 3 years developing that program from scratch, while Brandon constantly told me it was a worthless waste of time. What Brandon actually did was secretly forge my legal signature. He committed blatant corporate fraud by creating a shell company and illegally licensing my stolen intellectual property to Apex Global behind my back. The entire ballroom erupted in collective shocked gasps. People turned to stare at Brandon, who was visibly shaking near the bar. Beverly let out a loud, dramatic screech, demanding that someone cut the microphone feed, but the club staff remained completely frozen, entirely mesmerized by the unfolding spectacle. I did not stop. I raised my voice slightly, cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. When Apex Global initiated their buyout, they conducted rigorous corporate due diligence. Their forensic legal team easily discovered Brandon's sloppy amateur forgery. They instantly froze his fraudulent shell company out of the entire acquisition process to avoid acquiring stolen assets. He was permanently locked out. Brandon has absolutely zero money coming to him. He is currently facing a massive civil lawsuit for intellectual property theft and a highly probable federal indictment for wire fraud and forgery. The man you are all celebrating tonight is nothing more than a desperate cornered criminal. I turned my gaze directly toward Beverly and Courtney, who were standing completely paralyzed on the dance floor. Courtney's face had turned an ashen, sickly gray, while Beverly looked like she might actually pass out from the sheer public humiliation. As for this beautiful party, I continued gesturing to the melting ice sculptures and the extravagant floral arrangements, and the massive diamond ring my sister is currently wearing, and the luxury vehicles they have been heavily promoting on social media. None of it is real. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring every single word carried absolute devastating clarity. When Brandon realized the tech giant had frozen him out, he panicked. To keep up this pathetic illusion of wealth, he took out millions of dollars in predatory high-interest bridge loans using fraudulent proof of funds. He leveraged every single asset he had to secure cash he has absolutely no way to repay. Every drop of champagne you are drinking tonight, every caviar appetizer you have eaten, is funded by a massive mountain of toxic defaulting debt. They are entirely broke. They are currently drowning in severe financial liabilities that will inevitably force them into total bankruptcy. They have been parading around the city treating service workers like garbage and mocking my supposed failure, all while standing on a rapidly collapsing house of cards. I let the weight of their total financial ruin settle over the horrified audience. The wealthy socialites who had been eagerly kissing Beverly cheek just an hour ago were now looking at her with profound, unvarnished disgust. No one likes being made a fool of, and my family had just made fools of the entire local elite. I took a final deep breath. But the most ironic part of this entire tragedy, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational volume, is where the buyout money actually went. You see, Apex Global still wanted the software. So they legally bypassed Brandon fraudulent shell company entirely. To secure the rights without any legal liability, they went directly to the sole original patent holder. They wired the entire $39 million buyout directly into my personal bank account. I looked directly at Beverly, watching her entire reality shatter into a million irreparable pieces. That money has been sitting safely in my highly secure offshore trust for a month, I stated clearly. And I want to personally thank my mother for demanding I repay her $2,000 last week. By officially settling all my outstanding family debts, you provided my wealth management attorney with the final piece of legal documentation to completely sever my financial liability from your impending bankruptcy. You truly sealed your own fate. I looked at their broken faces, relishing the perfection of their public annihilation. I stepped away from the microphone, letting the shrill feedback echo through the utterly silent, devastated ballroom. The microphone feedback was still ringing in the ears of the stunned guests when the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom burst open. The disruption was not a late-arriving guest or a fresh tray of champagne. It was the brutal, undeniable crash of reality tearing through their fabricated world. Three men in dark tactical windbreakers stormed into the room, moving with aggressive, practiced efficiency. They were not country club security. The bold white lettering across their jackets clearly identified them as high-risk asset recovery agents. The head agent, a man with a thick neck and a clipboard, scanned the frozen crowd before locking his eyes directly on Brandon. He marched straight onto the dance floor, completely ignoring the horrified gasps of the wealthy socialites. He did not lower his voice or attempt to maintain any sense of high society decorum. He loudly demanded the immediate surrender of the keys to the white G-Wagon and the matte black Porsche currently parked in the VIP circle. He informed Brandon in front of 200 of the most influential people in the city that both vehicles were being actively repossessed due to severe defaults on fraudulent bridge loans. He stated clearly that emergency court injunctions had been officially filed that very afternoon, authorizing the immediate seizure of all leveraged collateral. Courtney let out a sharp, terrified shriek, clutching her stomach as if the repossession agents were physically attacking her. She screamed at Brandon, demanding he do something, demanding he fix this massive public humiliation. Brandon just stood there, completely paralyzed, his expensive crystal tumbler finally slipping from his sweaty fingers and shattering into 100 jagged pieces on the polished hardwood floor. He had absolutely no power left. He reached into his tailored pocket with shaking hands and pulled out the keys, tossing them onto the floor like a defeated coward. The head agent scooped them up, signaling to his team outside. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, the entire captive audience watched the final act of this tragic comedy unfold. Two heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks had backed into the circular brick driveway. The guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the pristine white SUV and the aggressive matte black sports car were unceremoniously hooked up and violently dragged onto the steel beds. The flashing amber lights of the tow trucks illuminated the horrified faces of the country club elite, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the total destruction of my family fake empire. Beverly collapsed into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face, sobbing uncontrollably as her entire social standing evaporated into thin air. She knew that by tomorrow morning, she would be completely blacklisted from every single country club charity board and elite social circle in the state. Courtney stood completely alone on the dance floor, sobbing hysterically, her massive unpaid-for diamond ring suddenly looking like a heavy, terrifying shackle. The guests began to aggressively murmur among themselves, pulling out their phones to text their friends outside the club, rapidly spreading the news of the spectacular collapse. I did not stay to watch them suffer any further. I had delivered exactly what I promised. I turned my back on the absolute wreckage and walked calmly out of the ballroom, leaving them to face the catastrophic, undeniable consequences of their own malicious greed. 3 months passed before the absolute finality of their destruction was permanently cemented into public record. The crisp autumn wind sweeping through downtown Seattle perfectly matched the cold, brutal reality that had violently consumed my former family. Brandon arrogant house of cards did not just collapse, it was pulverized into fine dust by the relentless aggressive machinery of the federal justice system. The predatory bridge loan financiers had completely gutted his assets within 72 hours of the disastrous country club incident. They seized the suburban house, emptied his personal checking accounts, and liquidated his remaining meager investment portfolios to cover a fraction of his rapidly defaulting high-interest debt. But the civil financial ruin was merely the opening act of his total annihilation. The United States Department of Justice officially unsealed a devastating 42-page federal indictment against him. He was formally charged with 5 counts of felony wire fraud, criminal forgery, and grand intellectual property theft. I watched the local news broadcast of his arraignment from the quiet comfort of my luxury penthouse. The man walking up the concrete courthouse steps in heavy metal handcuffs bore absolutely no resemblance to the slick, arrogant tech mogul who had tried to bully me on the sidewalk. His custom-tailored designer suits had been confiscated by federal authorities. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray detention uniform, his face incredibly gaunt, pale, and covered in a patchy, unkempt beard. The absolute terror in his wide eyes was broadcast in high definition across the entire state for everyone to see. Because his assets were entirely frozen and aggressively seized, he could not afford the massive retainers required by elite corporate defense attorneys. He was assigned an overworked public defender who took one single look at the overwhelming mountain of forensic digital evidence provided by Apex Global and immediately advised him to surrender unconditionally. Brandon's fragile ego finally broke completely under the crushing weight of inevitable federal prison time and undeniable guilt. He accepted a brutal binding plea deal, pleading guilty to all major charges to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial that would only increase his sentence. He was facing a mandatory minimum of 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole or appeal. He had traded a loyal, brilliant wife and a comfortable, stable life for a concrete cell, a metal toilet, and a permanent, devastating criminal record. The man who had mocked my supposed failure was now nothing more than a convicted felon, completely stripped of his freedom, his wealth, and his dignity. He would spend the next decade of his life completely locked away from the world he desperately tried to conquer. His name became a cautionary tale in the tech industry, a permanent stain on the corporate landscape. He had lost everything, his freedom, his reputation, and his future, purely because his boundless greed completely blinded him to his own overwhelming incompetence. While Brandon was locked away awaiting his formal sentencing, Courtney and Beverly were left entirely alone to navigate the catastrophic wreckage of their vanity-fueled spending spree. The glittering illusion of their incoming tech wealth had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, suffocating mountain of inescapable debt. During their month-long delusion, they had aggressively charged hundreds of thousands of dollars to high-limit credit cards and signed binding personal guarantees for luxury goods they could not actually afford. The massive 6-carat emerald-cut diamond ring Courtney had eagerly shoved in my face was forcibly repossessed by a furious high-end jeweler who arrived at their door with armed security and a court order. The prestigious boutiques where Beverly had arrogantly demanded personal shoppers and private viewing rooms officially banned them from the premises, handing their unpaid, exorbitant invoices directly over to aggressive corporate debt collection agencies. The massive catering venue and floral bills from their disastrous country club engagement party went into immediate severe default, compounding daily with massive late penalties. The collection calls began ringing from dawn until dusk, relentless automated voices and angry agents demanding immediate payment for a luxury lifestyle that had never truly existed. They desperately tried to return the expensive silk gowns, the imported cashmere coats, and the exclusive designer handbags. But high-end retail stores do not offer cash refunds for items purchased with fraudulent credit limits or visibly worn to public social events. Courtney was forced to sell her remaining authentic jewelry to predatory downtown pawn shops for absolute pennies on the dollar just to afford basic weekly groceries and prenatal vitamins. The crushing, relentless anxiety of their severe financial reality rapidly deteriorated their once tight-knit, toxic relationship. They spent their days screaming at each other in the echoing hallways of their rapidly emptying home, each blaming the other for their spectacular downfall and profound misery. The suburban house that Beverly had prized above all else, her ultimate symbol of high society status and maternal superiority, was aggressively foreclosed upon by the primary mortgage lender. She had secretly taken out a massive, risky second mortgage to help fund Brandon's initial legal defense before realizing his criminal case was entirely hopeless and the money was totally gone. When the bank eventually served the official eviction notice, they were given exactly 10 days to permanently vacate the prestigious property they had once proudly called their own. They scrambled desperately to pack their remaining belongings, stuffing their ruined designer clothing into cheap cardboard boxes, while foreclosure agents stood menacingly in the driveway, monitoring their every single move. The beautiful nursery Courtney had bragged about decorating remained completely empty, a stark, depressing reminder of the fraudulent promises that had destroyed their lives. Every single asset they possessed was legally seized, leaving them with absolutely zero financial safety net to fall back on. Their credit scores were completely obliterated, ensuring they could not even secure a standard auto loan or basic apartment lease without facing immediate rejection from absolutely every single financial institution in the state. Beverly tried desperately to reach out to her wealthy country club friends, begging them for emergency bridge loans or even a temporary place to stay while they figured things out. She quickly and painfully discovered that high society friendships are entirely conditional and utterly fragile, built solely on mutual wealth and superficial status. The women who had eagerly listened to her malicious gossip and toasted her supposed success completely abandoned her the exact second the fraud scandal broke on the evening news. The country club board of directors officially revoked her long-standing membership, citing the massive public embarrassment of the vehicle repossession incident and her severely unpaid membership dues. Her desperate phone calls went straight to voicemail. Her frantic, pleading text messages were left unread and entirely ignored. Former friends actively crossed the street to avoid walking past her in the local grocery store, refusing to make eye contact or acknowledge her existence. The total social isolation was absolute punishing and entirely inescapable. They were completely toxic pariahs in the very community they had tried so ruthlessly to dominate and control. With absolutely no money, no remaining liquid assets, and no friends willing to help, they were forced to hire a cheap discount moving company to hastily clear out the foreclosed suburban home. They watched in sheer agonizing despair as bank-appointed corporate liquidators ruthlessly auctioned off Beverly expensive antique furniture, imported rugs, and fine china to satisfy the outstanding legal judgments against them. Stripped of all their worldly possessions, they were forced to rent a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a run-down, decaying complex on the far industrial edge of the city. It was exactly the kind of squalid, depressing living situation Beverly had maliciously mocked me for supposedly inhabiting just a few months prior. Courtney, now heavily pregnant, spent her days crying uncontrollably in a cramped, humid bedroom, entirely abandoned by her fraudulent criminal husband and completely rejected by her former glamorous social circle. The wealthy, effortless future she had eagerly betrayed her own sister to secure had permanently transformed into a claustrophobic, waking nightmare of crushing poverty and inescapable public shame. Beverly, who had built her entire rigid identity on projecting an image of flawless suburban superiority, was severely reduced to aggressively clipping coupons and actively dodging daily calls from relentless collection agencies. They had spent years dedicating their lives to trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and destitute. Through their own unrestrained malicious greed and boundless blinding arrogance, they had manifested that exact miserable, terrifying reality entirely for themselves. They were utterly trapped in the miserable consequences of their own actions, completely isolated in their absolute ruin. Every single day was a brutal reminder of the incredible wealth and comfort they had carelessly thrown away, simply to indulge their petty cruelty. Their punishment was not just the complete loss of their financial stability, but the permanent, inescapable knowledge that they had actively engineered their own spectacular and irreversible downfall, perfectly handing me the ultimate satisfying absolute victory. I sat at my massive mahogany desk, reviewing launch protocols for our newest accessibility suite. My company had just grown exponentially. The initial $39 million capital injection allowed me to hire the brightest minds in the industry. We were actively changing the digital landscape, and I was the undisputed architect of that transformation. I wore a tailored crimson blazer projecting absolute authority. My mind was focused entirely on the future, unburdened by ghosts of my past. My intercom buzzed, cutting through the silence. It was my head of security, a former military officer named Reynolds. His voice was strictly professional but carried a faint trace of tension. He informed me two women were causing a disturbance in the lobby. They were aggressively demanding to speak with the chief executive officer, refusing to leave. They claimed to be my mother and sister. A profound sense of absolute calm washed over me. I did not feel the familiar spike of anxiety that used to accompany interactions with my toxic family. I simply felt the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a failed experiment. I told Reynolds I would be right down. I smoothed the lapels of my crimson blazer and walked confidently toward the private executive elevator. The ride down took exactly 45 seconds. I used that brief window to center myself entirely. I was no longer the frightened, discarded wife holding a cardboard box. I was a multi-millionaire tech founder about to deliver final absolute closure to the darkest chapter of my entire existence. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the expansive sunlit lobby of my corporate headquarters. The floor was polished Italian marble, and the walls were lined with sleek digital displays showcasing our software solutions. Standing directly in the center of this modern, opulent fortress were Beverly and Courtney. The sight of them was genuinely jarring. They looked completely broken, stripped of the arrogant high society gloss they had so desperately tried to project just a few months ago. Beverly wore a faded beige trench coat that had seen better days. Her previously immaculate highlighted hair was limp, showing stark gray roots. Her posture, once rigid with profound condescension, was now hunched and utterly defeated. Courtney stood beside her, heavily pregnant and looking absolutely miserable. The flawless designer gowns and the massive fake diamond ring were completely gone. She wore a cheap, oversized maternity sweater and scuffed athletic shoes. She looked terrified, clutching the strap of a worn canvas tote bag as if it were her only lifeline. They were surrounded by 3 uniformed security guards maintaining a firm perimeter around them. The wealthy guests at the country club had abandoned them. The predatory lenders had stripped them of every material asset. They had absolutely nowhere else to go, and no one else to manipulate. They had finally been forced to crawl directly to the very woman they had maliciously tried to destroy. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, the sharp rhythmic clicking of my designer heels echoing loudly through the cavernous main lobby. Beverly and Courtney turned their heads at the sound. When they saw me approaching, their eyes widened in absolute shock and desperate awe. They were finally seeing the true, undeniable magnitude of the empire I had built. I stopped a few feet away from them, signaling my security team to hold their positions. I did not offer a greeting. I did not smile. I simply stood there radiating absolute impenetrable power and waited for them to speak. Beverly took a hesitant, trembling step forward. The aggressive bullying tone she had weaponized against me for 34 years was gone, replaced by a pathetic, whining whimper. She clasped her hands together in a theatrical, pleading gesture. She told me they had lost absolutely everything. She cried the banks foreclosed on the suburban house, and they were currently living in a terrible, cramped apartment in a highly dangerous neighborhood. She begged me to look at Courtney and have some basic human compassion for my pregnant sister. She wildly claimed Brandon completely deceived them all, and they were just innocent victims of his malicious corporate fraud. Courtney eagerly joined the pathetic performance, tears streaming down her pale, blotchy cheeks. She frantically apologized for her behavior at the country club, aggressively blaming her pregnancy hormones, and Brandon manipulative lies for her profound cruelty. She sobbed she was going to be a single mother with zero financial support and a mountain of inescapable legal debt. She reached her hand out toward me, begging for a second chance. She pleaded that family is forever and we needed to stick together during these difficult times. She asked me to pay off their remaining debts and buy them a modest house so her baby could have a safe place to grow up. She promised they would never ask for anything ever again if I just saved them from this horrific nightmare. I listened to their frantic, desperate begging without a single ounce of empathy. Their apologies were completely hollow, motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine remorse for the devastating pain they caused me. They did not regret abusing me or trying to steal my intellectual property. They only regretted they had backed the wrong horse and lost their luxurious lifestyle. They were trying to use the concept of family they previously weaponized against me to extract my wealth. I looked directly into Beverly's tear-filled eyes, then shifted my unyielding gaze to Courtney. The silence I let hang between us was heavy, suffocating, and final. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet precision of a judge delivering an inescapable terminal sentence. I told them their concept of family was entirely conditional, built solely on utility and submission. I reminded them when I was at my absolute lowest, when my husband betrayed me, and I had only $500, they gleefully threw me out onto the street. I reminded them they publicly celebrated my supposed demise and eagerly participated in a calculated scheme to rob me of my life work. I took a deliberate step closer, ensuring my voice carried the absolute finality of my decision. I told them I built this entire empire alone, fueled by the software code they mocked and the resilience they severely underestimated. I stated clearly that my wealth, my success, and my future were permanently sealed off from them. I informed them they were standing in a building funded by the exact $39 million they greedily tried to steal from me. I watched the agonizing realization wash over their pale, broken faces. They finally understood there was absolutely no manipulation tactic, no fake tear, and no desperate plea that could possibly penetrate the fortress I had constructed around my heart. Beverly let out a loud, tragic sob, reaching out to grab the sleeve of my crimson blazer. She begged me to be reasonable, claiming leaving them on the street was too cruel a punishment for any mother to endure. She cried they had nothing left and nowhere to go. I looked at the woman who spent my entire life making me feel inherently worthless. I looked at the sister who eagerly stole my husband and actively plotted my absolute ruin. I felt a profound, deeply satisfying sense of total closure. I delivered the final, devastating blow, perfectly echoing the exact cruel words my mother had used against me in the very beginning. "Be realistic," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. "You need to pack your bags." I turned my back, severing the toxic tether binding me to their malicious greed for over 3 decades. I looked at Reynolds, giving a single private, sharp nod. The security team stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall of uniforms between me and the sobbing women. Reynolds firmly instructed them to exit the premises immediately, informing them any future attempts to enter the building would result in arrest for criminal trespassing. I walked away, the chaotic sounds of their forceful removal fading into the background. I stepped inside the private metal car, pressing the button for the top floor. The doors slid shut, permanently locking away the pathetic remnants of my former family. The ride up to the penthouse office felt incredibly light. I stepped out into my corporate sanctuary, walking directly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows wrapping around my corner office. The vibrant city stretched out endlessly below me, bathed in the warm light of the late afternoon sun. I placed my hands on the cool glass, looking down at the busy intersections. I was no longer a victim trapped in a dark basement, desperately seeking validation. I had successfully transformed my deepest trauma into a powerful, unstoppable empire. I faced the ultimate betrayal and emerged with impenetrable strength. I took a deep, steady breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean air of total victory. My future was entirely mine to command and undeniably brilliant. When you spend your life desperately seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it, you hand them the pen to write your story. For years, I allowed my mother's harsh criticisms, my sister's selfish entitlement, and my ex-husband's calculated gaslighting to convince me I was nothing more than a failure. But the truth is, toxic people don't belittle you because you lack worth. They do it because they are terrified of what will happen when you finally realize your own power. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't just how to protect my assets or navigate corporate law, it was the profound strength of silence and emotional detachment. When you are betrayed by the very people who should protect you, your first instinct is often to scream, to defend yourself, to prove them wrong. But arguing with narcissists only feeds their egos. The most devastating response you can give them is absolute indifference. While they exhausted their energy projecting a fraudulent image of success and trying to tear me down, I used my energy to quietly build an undeniable empire. Never let anyone else's narrow, selfish perspective dictate your reality. Your quiet dedication is not a failure, and walking away from toxic family members is not a weakness. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Let them have their illusions while you build your reality. Have you ever been pushed to your absolute breaking point by the people who were supposed to be your family? How did you find the courage to finally walk away, set boundaries, and build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If my journey to claiming my worth and protecting my peace resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving betrayal and taking back your power. Remember, the best revenge isn't destruction, it's phenomenal, undeniable success.